Go. Right, ladies and gentlemen, call out to order. Could I please invite, on behalf of the opening team from Sydney, the Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, despite the extreme conditions in this room in terms of this air conditioning, it's time for opening government in this debate to turn up the heat. And we say this debate takes place in a context where just last week America has said that Iran does not have the capacity to use their nuclear sources for nuclear weapons. We say on this side of the House that Iran has no inalienable right to weapons, nor does it have an inalienable right to pursue peaceful nuclear programs either. So that change and that new information might suggest that it's okay now that we should back off Iran a little bit. But on this side of the House, we say now is the perfect moment to pursue even tougher diplomatic regimes in an attempt to capitalise on this change and err on the side of caution. So what's the real problem in today's debate? And that's when we look at Iran's entire history when it comes to nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Not only has Iran been deliberately deceitful, deliberately antagonistic about the purpose of their nuclear supplies, about the capacity of their nuclear supplies, about the quality of their nuclear supplies, but they continue to say they have the inalienable right to pursue anything that they feel is fit. No thank you. We think that no sovereign right to nuclear energy should be accepted by the West. So what's our solution? One, we say that the West should continue to press for open IAEA inspections on the terms of the IAEA rather than the terms of Ahmadinejad, which have often been the case in the past. Second of all, we think we should use every kind of diplomatic measure possible in order to discourage the development of peaceful nuclear programs in Iran. If they continue to persist with those kinds of mechanisms, we would treat it as seriously as a breach of getting nuclear weapons, because we don't think they have that right. So what's my first point in today's debate? And that's simply why Iran cannot be trusted. No thank you. My second point is about why double standards are not unprecedented and actually quite reasonable when it comes to energy. And the third thing is about our right to intervene in Iran to do with their nuclear program. So first of all, why is Iran dodgy? We'd say that Iran's history is littered with dodgy events, from the fact that they test missiles like the Shrub-3 all the time, their history of false statements and obstructing inspections on multiple occasions, the fact that they give false leads about whether they have nuclear facilities in downtown Tehran as a means of discouraging weapons inspectors and discouraging surgical strikes. We'd say that all the time, not only in light of those interactions with official bodies, but moreover, their express intention to do things like wipe Israel off the map is an unequivocal statement of an ambition that cannot be trusted and must be curtailed. I'll take you in a minute. So even though we now know they have no capacity at the moment, when the process of enrichment is so similar between weapons and between peaceful energy programs, and so possible to fall into the hands of terrorists, particularly when Iran sponsors terrorists, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say that we should give no legitimacy to that program. Yes?
As long as they're not doing uranium enrichment, which is a very specific form of enrichment, I don't think they're necessarily posing a threat with nuclear arms.
No, we don't think it's that specific. It gets more specific as you go along, but at the very start, you acknowledge a right to uranium. And as soon as you start to let those kinds of concessions in, we'd say it gets very blurry, and particularly when we can't trust these leaders, it's particularly dangerous. But the last point about why Iran can't be trusted has to examine why diplomacy will work and why diplomacy will have some effect. And here again, we'd point you to the change in climate. We'd point you to the new information we now have. Now is the time where we have already called Ahmadinejad's bluff to consolidate that. He's blushing because we called him bluff. To consolidate that, ladies and gentlemen, to undermine the rhetoric of nationality that he uses for these kinds of programs when he knows the international community has an awful lot of information. So my second point, why are double standards precedented in response to energy? And we point you to the very basis and the very factual matrix around the NPT itself, which was developed in order to discourage weaponry. And it's unfortunate perhaps, but it was precedented on a double standard to begin with about certain nations who couldn't pursue any nuclear weapons post-World War II. And when we'd say Iran is on the brink of pursuing those weapons. And we'd say from the start we acknowledge that Britain can pursue peaceful programs and we're not letting Iran do it. But at the same time, we don't think Britain has ever expressed an intention, though most popular, expressed an intention to wipe off another country off the map. And that's a huge difference in terms of what nations can be trusted to act responsibly and which ones can't. Adam.
Why will there ever again be any incentive for anyone to sign up to the NPT?
Yeah.
Because we think that we can look at double standards all the time in terms of the way Iran negotiates with those kinds of international bodies. We think that there's an incentive for people to sign up if they are willing to cooperate and are willing to organise themselves with the IAEA in a responsible fashion. We think this discourages people like Ahmadinejad from leading the IAEA on deliberately mistrustful paths and telling them lies in case you get this double standard smacked on you. We don't think it's time to keep making concessions for Iran any further. We think that the historical origins of the document are such as I've outlined, but at the same time, international consensus around an organised document is far better than none at all. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to talk about the right to intervene in relation to Iran's energy program. We think giving Iran any more room to move is intensely problematic. Firstly, because they are so bent on becoming a regional superpower through undercut means. They want to expand their power in the region. That's why they fund Sunni extremists in Iraq to get some power there. That's why they fund groups like Hezbollah in order to get some power there. The best way in which to manage those kinds of ambitions is to cut it off at the earliest possible point rather than playing along like we really think Iran is giving us the fair deal and telling us the truth about what they're doing. We simply cannot continue to treat Iran as an equal when Iran continues to flaunt in the face of the rest of the West and not cooperate in those systems like everyone else. We think a harsher standard is completely appropriate. So in conclusion, do we think diplomacy is an effective tool? Yes. Do we think Ahmadinejad is an ambitious liar? Yes. Do we think Iran is a nation who ought to be discouraged from nuclear capacities in all forms? The answer is yes. On this side of the House, ladies and gentlemen, as I've said, it's time to turn up the heat. If we're serious about regional stability and the responsible use of nuclear capacities, we must say no to Iran.
I thank the Prime Minister for kicking off the case on behalf of the government bench. Now to do the same thing for the opposition. Leader of Opposition.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition here this afternoon would like to stand up in defence of the only way that is likely to lead to a world where we do not live under constant threat of nuclear explosion. We believe that only if we oppose this proposition can we keep the fragile bargain of the Non-Proliferation Treaty together. Can we set up a system governed by rules that will prevent countries around the world from pursuing their own nuclear programs, from pursuing programs that we do not know about? Ladies and gentlemen, the prop is damaging because it damages this fundamental bargain of the NPT. That is the opposition's case today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 points. I'm firstly going to fully engage with what Naomi said about how we should put more international pressure on Iran and change the standard about what international pressure we do put on Iran. But then I'm going to analyse the NPT properly. I'm going to tell you exactly why what Naomi said is going to mean that other countries are going to feel more oppressed by the NPT than they do at the moment, why that will make it less likely that they will comply with the NPT and the IAEA, and why that is negative for the world as a whole. So let me start off by looking at Naomi's case. Now, insofar as she was clear about exactly what she was going to do, it seemed that what she wanted to do was increase international pressure to the point where she was going to change the standard for major international pressure and intervention from one where Iran had nuclear weapons to one where Iran could not be clearly having a fully peaceful nuclear program, to one where the IAEA would say there are irregularities, and then she would have increased international pressure. On the opposition, we simply don't think that's a feasible thing to do in the world system today. We don't think you can get up and say we'd like to do this if it's not going to be supported. We think the only people who are going to support this are in fact a small set of Western nations. We think that's going to damage our ability to control Iran. And here's why. We've had in the past few years an increasing consensus in the world stage that maybe Iran does have wider global ambitions. Maybe Iran does want to produce nuclear weapons. Our credibility on saying that is kind of a bit shot at the moment because the United States just said that Iran didn't. Our credibility is a bit shot. So our ability to get other people in the world to join with Western nations, our ability to get other people to join with Western nations in producing, in producing this is rather reduced at the moment. No. And so what happens? It simply means we cannot get Russia and China to impose sanctions on Iran. They will only do so if they are fully believe that the case is needed. As they don't, they're unlikely to do it. Why are you going to get everybody you need on side?
Iran already complains that it's got a double standard held against it. Isn't the most important issue in this context then to curb their capacity to develop those ambitions?
Okay, like firstly, double standards aren't created equal, and just because there's one double standard exists doesn't mean you can make the standard even worse and expect no change to happen. But secondly, if you can't get Russia and China on board, and we've already had problems when people thought that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, in which case you're certainly not going to be able to get them on board just for simple treaty breaches. If you can't get Russia and China on board, you don't have effective sanctions on Iran, so you don't have effective international pressure. So what you do is that you find out less and have less leverage on Iran when you actually do become convinced again that they have nuclear weapons, because you've shot your credibility and cried wolf too early. And because of that, that means that you're less likely to know about Iran and less likely to be able to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons in the future. This damages our ability to control Iran, and that's my first point. But my second point is about the NPT, and it's the core of our case today. Thank you. And our second point is this. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a very fragile bargain between nuclear weapon states, the 5 states, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Russia, and China, who had nuclear weapons before 1960. And the rest of the world. It is a fragile bargain whereby the nuclear weapon states say, we will give you peaceful nuclear technology in exchange that you do not develop nuclear weapons. And they also say, and this is part of the NPT treaty commitment, the nuclear weapon states commit to pursuing negotiations in good faith for nuclear disarmament. That was in 1960. Quite clearly, from 1960 to 2007, there have been no real good faith negotiations for nuclear disarmament on the part of the nuclear weapon states. This is just one part, where the rest of the world believes that the nuclear weapon states are not fulfilling their side of the bargain in the NPT. Now what happens? Trump gets up, and Trump says, we're changing the standard, and we're going to really, really clamp down on Iran's ability to have a peaceful nuclear program. It's not quite clear if they'll actually let Iran have everything they're allowed to under the NPT, but I'd like to find out if you will.
You asking me a question? I'm asking you a question. Why shouldn't we hold a double standard to someone who doesn't follow the standards in the first place?
Okay, here's why. I've already just pointed out that there is this double standard. There is this double standard, firstly, that nuclear weapon states are allowed to have nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states aren't. But there's a second, more insidious double standard that you are perpetuating. That nuclear weapon states can get away with not engaging in negotiations for disarmament in good faith, but non-nuclear weapon states have to fully comply with their provisions under the NPT. That we can already see this as a problem, that non-nuclear weapon states aren't buying into this. The NPT is reviewed every 5 years. In the last 2 review conferences in 2005 and 2000, there was no agreement between the parties to the NPT because there was too much acrimony about nuclear weapon states not engaging in good faith negotiations for disarmament. So there basically isn't any trust between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states. What this prop does is it appears to further deny the rights of non-nuclear weapon states to actually have peaceful nuclear technology. It appears to perpetuate that double standard. Given the NPT is such a fragile bargain, its current members can't agree on where to take it next or on how to support it. Given that, we simply don't think that increasing this double standard is actually going to do anything. If you make a double standard worse and you annoy more countries, as apparently getting harsh on Iran working within their existing treaty agreements is going to do, if you do that, we think that other countries are less likely to agree with the NPT. Simply, other countries say, well, hold on, you're not really letting Iran have the full things they're allowed under the treaty. You're imposing an even harsher standard on them. Why should we still comply with a treaty that we see as neo-colonialist, that we see as perpetuating an imbalance in world affairs, that we see as denying our own rights as individual actors on the world stage? There is already massive disagreement about the NPT, but the NPT is tragically important for our ability to live in a world that doesn't have nuclear weapons. If we damage the NPT, we damage our ability, firstly, to know that there are only 5 to 8 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. But secondly, we damage the ability actually to have confidence that other people aren't going to feel afraid, other people aren't going to not abide by this bargain and further move into nuclear weapons development on their own. The NPT is critical to the way that we ensure that international peace and security today. It should be treated with a heck of a lot more respect than simply getting up and saying, we'll be nastier to one country because we don't just trust them. You've got to look at the wider impact of what that does to other countries in the NPT. It is so deeply negative that I beg to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition. Now to continue with the Government's case, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for an opposition leader that was concerned about the fragility of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it seems strange to this side of the House that he seems to think that the preservation of the document and the terms and the quality of that document should come ahead of tackling the most rogue and ambitious nuclear state that we have in the world. We say the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, when it was devised, didn't accommodate for situations like Iran that have since developed. And it's in the interest of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have the capacity to tackle the single biggest nuclear threat in the world, because otherwise you render that document redundant. And that's what cements the decline and the disregard of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, when this side of the House goes soft on Iran and allows them to, in the privacy of their own homes, behind closed doors, enrich uranium, which might one day be used to wipe Israel off the map. So what am I going to do in this speech? It's going to be a wonderful tapestry of rebuttal and substantive material. I'm going to address 3 questions. Firstly, the central question of this debate, something I think the opposition leader struggled to deal with, was how do we control Iran? The second question will be the secondary issue in this debate, that of the opposition leader's case. What does this mean for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? And thirdly, let's look at this precedent set and this message it sends to unnamed countries somewhere else in the world that the opposition leader didn't care to detail. So firstly, what did Giles tell us? He told us that the proposition today exaggerated the double standard. He said that there was an existing double standard in which Britain and America were allowed to have nuclear weapons, but Iran wasn't. But the conditions imposed by my esteemed Prime Minister in this debate exaggerated that double standard. And that was effectively the extent of the harm outlined by the opposition leader in this debate. Because we think if you look at this from the perspective of Iran, if you look at this from the perspective of Ahmadinejad, which is pretty hard if you happen to be a sane and rational person, he already thinks that the West is against him in every way. He already thinks that that double standard is egregious because he believes he has a right to nuclear weapons. So the difference for Ahmadinejad is effectively hair-splitting when you're talking about controlling Iran. But as Naomi told you, in terms of being able to control Iran in this situation, we're at a point where we have called Ahmadinejad's bluff. He's been embarrassed on the national stage because he simply isn't as powerful as he happens to think he is. And we think in that climate, this is not where you back off, but you press harder and harder to send a clear message to Iran that their nuclear ambitions and indeed their regional ambitions are not acceptable and will not be tolerated by the West. Let's deal with the second point he told us. He told us that it would be undermined by other countries, that Russia and China wouldn't get on board. Again, under the status quo, Russia and China are already really on board. Now, Russia has been giving them nuclear rods for years. That doesn't mean we didn't get them to open up inspection centres in April. It doesn't mean that in August of this year, the IAEA weren't able to walk into Iran. It shows that Russia and China aren't central to this issue. And if you're willing to make concessions to Russia and China just to appease them, then you're going to give up on the whole project. We don't believe that they play that key role in this area, but moreover, we think trying to appease them so that they can continue dodgy kind of geopolitical moves to make themselves look more important and align themselves with Iran is something that's not a noble aspiration to be doing. Yes, Giles?
Okay, given that Russia supplies Iran with its nuclear technology, if you can't get Russia on board, does your prop have any teeth?
Yeah, it does, because it has teeth at the moment. There's teeth at the moment where they've opened up inspections 3 times this year. What we'd say is crack down on Russia, rather than saying to Russia, we're happy to support your model of a double standard because we think that you really should be good friends with Iran. We think the pressure that comes is when you don't back off from putting pressure on Iran and allowing Russia to sidle up to them as a friend. So that's why we still can control Iran, because they're being weakened in the current position, because Iran doesn't see that hair-splitting difference that the opposition leader chose to do, and because, for all the reasons that Giles didn't want to talk about, their ambitions in the region are unacceptable and should be curtailed. What does this then mean for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? What the side has recognised was when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was conceived, it hadn't anticipated the case of Iran. And what needs to happen now is the Non-Proliferation Treaty needs to extend to recognise that the viability of that treaty is predicated on its ability to respond to the situation at hand. It's not like we pulled this double standard out of thin air. Iran has invited it by deliberately being obstructionist, by deliberately lying to the West, and by threatening to wipe countries off the world. The response to that is defined by their own actions, and we think that's the strength of the proposition in this debate. In terms of levelling out the playing field for a document that began with a double standard, we think the future of that document should be defined by how actors can create their position, and it should be responsive and reactive to the position that Iran has cut out for itself. But what did they tell us? Giles told us that it will discourage people signing up. It might discourage the other Irans in the world from signing up, but it was telling that Giles couldn't really provide a single example of like a Belgium who thought we're going to be offended by this extension of already existing double standard in terms of how they interact with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I'll take you in a moment. What we happen to think is that I've already discussed with Russia and China that the leverage there isn't lost. That countries will give up on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, however, in the alternative, if you allow Iran to get away with this, and then you see that the failure of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is to stop the single most rogue and ambitious country in the world developing nuclear capacities. Yes?
Most of the reactors in Iran come from Russia, and they're light water reactors that can't be used for uranium enrichment. Why is that so dangerous?
Because what is dangerous is firstly that they are enriching uranium and they have full levels of uranium to enrich. In terms of what they're getting from Russia, the danger is once you say and you legitimise, as Naomi told you, a state-based energy program, then you allow them a degree of privacy and you allow them to do a degree of backhanded door handling where we lose our grip on being able to monitor what Iran is doing, and when that's coupled with Iran's ambitions, we'd say that's unacceptable. We don't want to confer that legitimacy over their state energy program because we are mistrustful of them and we don't know where that will lead. So in answer to the second question, what does this mean from a non-proliferation treaty? We say that the success and the viability of the non-proliferation treaty turns on the question of Iran. We say compliance from Iran and hamstringing their capacity to go nuclear must be the primary aim. Over and above the non-compliance of imaginary countries like Belgium, say, that the opposition leader didn't care to name. But finally, what kind of precedent does this set? As I told you, we've adapted the Non-Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on this side of the House. We've told you it has to be responsive to the actions of those countries, and it has to be proportionate to the actions and threats of those countries. This sets the precedent for states that are currently non-nuclear, or current countries that are looking to kind of raise their power, that they can't do so in a way that's incompatible with the aims of world peace. So we're not worried about Britain's program in this debate, but we are worried about a country that wants to wipe Israel off the map. So the precedent that's set is for now and into the future, the way the IAEA treats you will depend on how you treat the IAEA, and those kind of nuclear ambitions that Iran has must be stopped. For that reason, we're very proud to report.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and now call for the speech to close the first half of the debate from the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
treaty real teeth when you interpret its implementation based on what you feel like and whether the leader of the state in question is a dodgy kind of guy. Right. What I want to do in my case today is I want to look at this question of double standards and whether they matter. I want to move on to that, to what happens when we have no real leverage, when we say Iran walks away alternatively. And finally, I want to look in more depth at the question of legitimacy and why it does matter that the NPT retains its legitimacy. But first, let's have a look at what we heard in Tunis. Because we heard, again, about the need to control Iran, because they're dangerous. And it was sometimes dressed up as the idea that this is, that the NPT didn't foresee countries like Iran. Apparently, the NPT didn't foresee the countries we might not want to have nuclear weapons might want to have nuclear weapons. That puzzles me anyway. But the idea is we have to control Iran because they want nuclear weapons. Firstly, we're not entirely persuaded of their evidence that Iran does want nuclear weapons. We say that isn't it just possible that the rhetoric about wanting to wipe Israel into the sea is just that, tough-thumping rhetoric like you hear from most politicians in the region. Even if it isn't, is it politically feasible for Ahmadinejad to develop nuclear weapons? We don't think it is, given the fragility of his position in Iran. Even if he does, is it technologically feasible, given their nuclear technology by the Russians and its heavy water reduction doesn't actually give you the possibility to enrich it in such a way that you can use it for weapons anyway? Again, we don't. So we're not convinced. I'm not the only person who's not convinced. The IAEA isn't convinced. The US isn't convinced. So we're going to have more convincing evidence than just he's a dodgy kind of guy who says nasty stuff. No, thank you. But even if they are, and let's say they are, then we say we need to deal with them in the real world. The way you deal with a rogue state in the real world is multilaterally. The way you deal with them is by global condemnation and by global interaction, not by making fictional agreements in the proposition world where they say, well, what are we going to do? We'll clamp down on Russia. Well, until we can understand what clamping down on Russia means, until we can understand exactly how we're going to clamp down on President Putin, who doesn't seem too bothered about Western clampdown so far, we don't think that's good enough. We think if they are as dangerous, if they really do have intentions to get nuclear weapons, we need to do a better job of proving that fact than we think that we need to get. And you say, it doesn't matter what kind of precedent does it set. You said it sets a precedent that countries will be dealt with toughly. No, we say it sets a precedent that the NPT is irrelevant to how you will be dealt with under the NPT. You'll be dealt with according to how the West thinks. We think that is important when you get states, possibly like Japan, like Brazil, like Argentina, who might be looking to develop nuclear technology in the future. We think it kind of does matter if they think, if these countries will be called into the NPT, and it matters how they think they will be dealt with. Tell me why not.
Is it responsible to allow a state that sponsors terrorism any legitimate access to uranium?
Yes, because we think it's fine because they can use it to power things. We think that's good. Incidentally, that's better than coal because global warming. That's a really boring case. Okay? Right. Okay, so now I want to talk about the double standard. Do double standards matter? And they say, well, we've got one, so why not have loads, right? This treaty was negotiated from an unequal position, so why not just renegotiate it every time we feel like it? We say no, right? Yes, the NPT, in a sense, is an unequal bargain. It is there to deal with a political reality in which there are some states who have nuclear weapons that are never going to give them up, and there are some states who can't be trusted with them. It deals with that political reality. People accept the inequality, even if they don't accept it, because they see something being in it for them. Now, everyone accepts that the NPT does that. Ahmadinejad may say, and the other leaders may say, oh, it's double standards, we want nuclear weapons too. But no one listens because they understand that's the terms of the treaty. Now, if you understand if you entrench your new double standard, which says, we say, actually, because you're dodgy kind of guys, and we think you might sponsor terrorism somewhere, therefore you're not allowed even a safe civilian technology, then that really is a double standard from which the world will not allow. No, thank you. And we say Russia and China are not going to play along anymore. There will be no pressure on them either to make an appearance of playing along, Mr. Chairman. We say the chances are they'll just walk away. And we think the chances are that Iran will be on perfectly good terms simply to walk away as well. When they say, we're trying to work with the IAEA, they say we're working with us, we're trying to work with the Russians and the Chinese, and everyone who wants to make the NPT work, and it's not good enough. And they walk away. And that's when it gets bad, and that's what I want to move on to now. Because when Iran starts saying, we're not going to comply at all, when Iran gets really difficult about admitting any inspectors at all, because they say the West are not playing fair with us, that gets dangerous. That gets dangerous because you lose the scrutiny that you have at the moment. When you have
at least, and you have at least, according to IAEA reports, on the whole, fairly good compliance, at least some compliance. You lose the scrutiny of knowing what is being done with their nuclear technology, and we think that's a big problem. You use the safety of knowing where their nuclear technology is coming from, and we use the safety of how it's being dealt with, which we think is a danger in Iran and outside it. We think these benefits are predicated on the fact that they are working within the system, that we have some kind of inspections regime that they want to comply with. We say we lose that under the prod. No thank you. And secondly, we say about, I want to tell you about legitimacy. Because the legitimacy of the NPT is important. They say, well, we're talking about fantasy states, and what does it matter how Belgium feel? Okay, we think it does matter if you undermine the credibility. And you undermine the credibility, firstly, by saying we'll negotiate however we like, and secondly, by completely undermining it by producing a proposition with no teeth. Because of course you're going to say Iran can develop civilian nuclear technology, but as we've shown, there's nothing you can actually do as long as the Russians keep supplying them, so they keep doing it. To further undermine its credibility in that sense. What happens there? Well, we get states opting out, and we think, yes, other potential Irans, yes, other countries we might like to bring into the NPT matter. We get less incentive and less pressure on member states to comply, less pressure on Western states to reduce their nuclear stockpiles, and we think that's secondly a problem. And thirdly, you undermine the climate and you undermine the general world order, which says that nuclear weapons technology is unacceptable, that the development of nuclear weapons technology is unacceptable, and that nations have to try and work together within the NPT. The NPT is already a fragile system. It is already a system that has a conference every 5 years in which the members can barely even agree on its own agenda. It is already a system, as the proposition tells us, with a built-in inequality. And when you take that and say, now we're going to enforce it arbitrarily, and when we enforce it arbitrarily, it's going to be pointless anyway because they're going to keep buying their reactors from Russia, you turn it into a joke. So if you want to achieve true scrutiny and true safety with the Iranian nuclear program, its civilian program, then you need to keep them under the NPT. If they are pursuing a weapons program, you're better off working within the international system and the NPT. And does the New World Order need a legitimate working NPT? You bet it does. Oppose this motion.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader, and now we come to the second half of the debate. You open that for us, the Member of Government.
Mr. Speaker, members of this illustrious House, we completely agree that the bargain that underpins the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a fragile one. But we say that's for a very good reason, that it's fundamentally a pretty stupid bargain. In this debate, what we're talking about is whether or not, after an apparent disavowal of nuclear weapons, it makes sense for countries to facilitate the transfer of civilian nuclear technology to Iran. We would suggest at closing, and this is what we'll be talking about later, is that how in enacting that very transfer of civilian technology, we make it almost inevitable that Iran will pursue nuclear weapons. And that's what I'll be talking about in my extension. But before I do, we need to talk about the two central preoccupying questions that have troubled the first half of the debate. The first is why on earth we should be worried about Iran. Well, we wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen, we offered 34 points of information to the opening opposition team. But the biggest reason why we should be very worried about giving any civilian nuclear technology to Iran is it just doesn't need any more power generation capacity. It is one of the biggest net exporters of power in the world. It has a massive gas pipeline which feeds almost sort of all of the Middle East with lots of its gas. But not only that, it has massive petroleum reserves. But secondly, the Iranian nuclear program is not a particularly important civilian nuclear power program because the reactors at Bushehr that the Russians are building are fundamentally very small. Now, our reaction to that, ladies and gentlemen, is not to say, well, it's a global warming, they might need more power, they're a growing economy. It's to say, think about it. Why on earth do they need more power for any other reason than nuclear weapons. What they're doing is exactly what North Korea are doing, using the legitimacy and the technological transfers that the NPT confers on nations to actually use it as a backdoor to getting nuclear weapons. The second thing that we would say rings alarm bells is that Iran hasn't disavowed nuclear weapons. Ahmadinejad in 2005 announced that they'd enriched uranium to the point where they could pursue nuclear weapons research. But not only that, they haven't cooperated with the IAEA, which is effectively a toothless regulatory agency when it comes to keeping nuclear weapons away from Iran. The third reason why we should be worried, and these guys were altogether a bit too glib about ignoring it, is that Iran is one of the most aggressive and hostile regimes in the world. When they're not assassinating diplomats on the streets of Buenos Aires or fighting proxy wars in Lebanon, they're threatening to drive Israel into the sea and talking of nuclear apocalypse. Now, if ever there was a case where there was a need for a double standard to ensure that maybe we were a little more cautious about ensuring nuclear weapons didn't go to a country, it would have to be Iran. The second question that preoccupied the first half of the debate was, what are the consequences for the NPT? Because the opening opposition correctly identified that a very fragile bargain underpins the NPT. Not only because in 1956, when the treaty was founded, 5 of the members already had nuclear weapons, but subsequently because Israel, Pakistan, India and North Korea have all achieved nuclear weapons effectively, either within or without the NPT. We would suggest that very few people in the world actually want nuclear weapons, which begs the question, well, what's the importance of this bargain? Because we would suggest, by contrast, that we actually should be a little more selective and a little more scrutineering, rather than just automatically giving over civil technology to these people after a tokenistic disavowal of nuclear weapons. Sir?
If Russia and China and so forth don't play ball, what's the point?
Well, look, this is debating, mate. It's not going to happen ever. But we think it's a good idea. But the second thing we have to talk about with respect to the consequences of the NPT is that we just think that the principle that everyone has a right to nuclear power is just fundamentally a bit problematic. And we think any movement towards the NPT, towards imposing a slightly tougher standard of how they're going to be using that nuclear power, is necessarily a very, very important one. The final thing that they want us to talk about was how it undermines cooperation and scrutiny. We question what cooperation with the IAEA in Iran, because it hasn't worked. This brings me to what I want to talk about in today's debate. How this proposal of giving civil nuclear technology to Iran fundamentally means Iran will inevitably get nuclear weapons. The first reason for that is that we think fundamentally that the provision of civil nuclear technology helps facilitate nuclear weaponization, because there's no clear line between where a military program begins and where a civil program ends. Because you need to enrich uranium for a civil program. You need the same infrastructure about a the same infrastructure with respect to building a nuclear civil program and a nuclear military program. But most importantly, you need the same scientists when it comes to building these programs. If you look at all the people like A.Q. Khan that have built nuclear military programs, they all came from the civil sector, where they built their expertise. And Iran already has the military devices and the missiles capable of delivering the device. By conferring legitimate personnel upon them, we think it's inevitable that they'll pursue it given their apparent lack of any need for it and their apparent desire for it. And that's exactly what happened in North Korea, where their nuclear facilities at Yongbyon, provided by the Chinese, actually helped facilitate the nuclear program. Because when they decided they would leave the NPT, they just kicked the IAE out of Yongbyon and started enriching the uranium in it. It's just boneheaded to think that the civil technology is just going to stop when you provide it. In fact, it's the very, very avenue by which they get to the military program to begin with. And that's why we think we should be exceptionally sceptical of any need to provide it to Iran. The second thing we would say, with respect to how it facilitates nuclear weaponization, is that it undermines, that it actually makes third-party cooperation with these countries a whole lot more difficult. Now, we think one of the problems of this system is that it allows Russia a green light to easily supply light water reactors to Bushehr. Now, we don't think that's a good thing, ladies and gentlemen, because we question the capacities of Russia to effectively regulate the nuclear world. What we see is that even with the Helms-Burton Act, they've completely failed to regulate the 2,000 nuclear missiles that are just missing from the old Soviet Soviet Union. But not only that, we've seen they're more than happy to provide nuclear weapons advice to all of these countries. That's how the Pakistanis that's where they ultimately got it from. Now we think, in that context, that regulation is much more difficult when you have an open embrace of civilian transfer because it compromises our capacity to deal with third parties. Mr. Speaker, this is a policy that makes sense because it rejects the fundamental bargain of the NPT as a little bit silly because it makes the world a whole lot more less safe.
Thank the Member of Government. Now we come across to the final team in this debate, Ataneo. Can we please hear from the Member of Opposition?
Pleasant afternoon, everyone. What we from Ataneo are going to bring to this debate are an analysis of the internal social forces within Iran, because it's very important to consider social change from within a regime and how it affects the way the regime makes decisions. And second, we'll talk to you about how civilian nuclear technology has historically been a bargaining chip to bring recalcitrant nuclear rogue states to the table to talk, and how you're crippling negotiations with your policy. But before I move on, I have a few rebuttals to make. First is to the whole idea of the double standard, because in an attempt to be soft, the opening team actually shoots themselves in the foot. Why? They concede to the value of civil nuclear technology. They concede that it can potentially be safe. They concede that it can potentially be efficient, which is why you will allow it elsewhere in the world, but you just don't want it in Iran. So you're going to allow it in North Korea. You're going to allow it in Israel. You're going to allow it in Pakistan and everywhere else. You're going to allow it in India. You're going to allow it in the United States, but not in Iran. And how do they justify the double standard? They say, but then historically, they have been against the US. Historically, they've refused to recognize Israel. So have a lot of other countries. Historically, they have ambitions to be regional leaders. So have a lot of other countries, Mr. Chair. But in the face of facts, such as the national intelligence community of the United States saying there are no harmful nuclear weapons being developed there, such as the IAEA saying this thrice, Mr. Chair, and such as admissions from Iranian officials, this sounds highly assertive and highly conspiracy theories, Mr. Chair. Please sit down. Second rebuttal is to this whole dismissive line from government side that, well, anyway, there's always been a double standard for Iran. Anyway, Iran is already against the US. Anyway, Ahmadinejad is already embarrassed. And anyway, Russia and China are not on board now, but we're doing something now. Therefore, even with all those things, we will still succeed. The answer to that is, Mr. Chair, the debate is a matter of extents. Before, moral high ground was on the side of the United States because you were asking for something reasonable. You were asking for them to stop manufacturing nuclear weapons and nuclear arms. But now, you're asking them to stop producing civil nuclear technology, which you are allowing the rest of the world to produce. So obviously, you lose that moral high ground, and that is the tipping point. That's why those factors that didn't matter as much before will matter now. That's why the threat of a Russian veto, assuming that this even flies in the UNSC, is even greater now than it was before. The next thing they say is we need we don't want to give Iran privacy, and we need inspectors there because the lines between civilian and military are very, very, very blurred. And we agree to a certain extent that the lines are blurred. That's why you need inspectors there in the first place. That's why you do not want a model that gives Iran an excuse to kick out IAEA completely. Because under your model, you'll not be able to tell at all. Fourth is this assertion that they don't need the nuclear technology because they're the largest petroleum exporter. I'll discuss in my case, well, that's not necessarily true, but in principle, we argue they're entitled to it. And rhetorical force is on their side to insist that they're entitled to it. We still have, assuming that they do not need it, why is it in principle not something they're entitled to? Yes.
Firstly, they have a lot of gas, but secondly, how did all of these regulatory capacities work in the case of North Korea, where the minute they got the nuclear weapons, they just kicked the IAEA out?
North Korea has not kicked the IAEA out to date. After the six-party talks where Russia and the US agreed to help build reactors, they are very, very cooperative. And if you say that North Korea is a bigger problem, assuming that it is, but that's not true, why does the model apply only to Iran? Why the double standard? So there are two things I want to discuss in today's debate. Number one, what they want to do, rally support for Iranian nuclear proliferation. And second, how it what cripples the ability to negotiate
Point of
with
information.
recalcitrant states. Because when you want to prevent the production of nukes for harmful means in a certain country, you want to consolidate support from everyone in the international community, even Iran's neighbors. But you also want the social forces in Iran to be on your side because they largely determine what Ahmadinejad can get away with or cannot get away with. And let's look at this notion of energy security. It's a very powerful notion, even in Iran. Because many states are against harmful nukes, but very few states are against civil nuclear technology. What is Iran's rhetoric today? They need civil nuclear technology because their energy needs are increasing and oil production levels are decreasing even if they're a major petroleum exporter. That's why it's getting costlier and costlier at the end of the day. And you also want them to sign on to so many climate change commitments. And it's getting costlier and costlier, please sit down, to rely on petroleum alone. That's why you see everyone scrummaging for alternative nuclear sources. And their rhetoric is, if Western economies have saved so much money throughout the last 50 years making use of civil nuclear technology, why won't you let us do the same thing? And there's a lot of sympathy for this view, Mr. Chair, from other countries in the Arab region, from China, from Russia, all over the world. Iran doesn't have much alternatives. It doesn't have lots of wind power. It doesn't have hydropower and things like that. So in principle, it's a legitimate, please sit down, way of energy security. But let's look at Iran now. We say that Ahmadinejad, yes, his position has weakened a bit after the exposure of, the bluff. And we say that his rhetoric of producing lots of nuclear weapons against the United States was never that popular. But the rhetoric of energy security was truly popular. So what's happening now? Because of that bluff, we say, yes, he's having a hard time, he's going to stand for elections in 2009, and his popularity is decreasing. Yes, even the supreme leader is slowly disassociating from him. What does your model do? Your model resurrects his declining popularity with this particular unreasonable move. And we say that it gets the population on board again for Ahmadinejad. Why? Because it's easier to demonize the United States again to the population. Now, it wasn't as easy before because what the US was asking for was reasonable. That's why a lot of Iranians have shifted alliances. That's why there's a reformist turn in the Iranian parliament. But what you do now is allow the population to be staunchly behind the Iranian president again as he goes through with his policy. Second is how it cripples the ability to negotiate with recalcitrant states. Let's look at historical trends, Mr. Chair. Every time we negotiated with a state that had nukes, the line was always stop intensive research and development into nuclear weapons, and we will provide you with the reactors, and we will help set up plants. This was the case in a 1994 agreed framework with North Korea. This is the case again after the six-party talks in 2000 and onwards. And we say that it's the Russian shipment, for example, of nuclear fuel to Iran that was able to extract a promise from Iran that it will stop at that point. And it's an effective carrot. Why is it an effective carrot? Because it undermines the ideological and rhetorical basis for development of more nuclear technology. If you already have what you say you need, why do you need to develop more? And it makes it easier to police that country and harder for that country to justify more nuclear development. Without this carrot, Mr. Chair, and if you say these countries are so bent on looking like regional leaders, do you think they will agree to any concession? They will not. You need this carrot on the table for non-proliferation on a harmful level to continue to exist. And with that, we extend.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. Now we come back to the final speech on the government bench from the government whip.
Alright, I'll just start. Mr. Speaker, it's not every day that you hear the 1994 Framework Agreement with North Korea cited as a success of nuclear diplomacy. That's for a very good reason. It's that the thrust put forward by the closing that you need civilian nuclear power as a bargaining chip is fundamentally wrong because of the fact that rogue states use it as a bargaining chip to come to the negotiating table every time they relapse on their agreements. They don't use it as a bargaining chip once to come and make concessions. They use it as a bargaining chip every time they run out of money, every time they need a helping hand in their nuclear development, and every time they damn well feel like it because they're rogue states who don't respect agreements and don't respect the rule of international law, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to look at three things in this speech. The first is how do we bargain with Iran, and what is the best form of nuclear diplomacy to deal directly with this extension. The second is going to cross both sides of the bench, and that's look at what is Iran's need or right to nuclear weapons. The third thing I'm going to look at is how we best strengthen the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So let's look at this question of nuclear diplomacy. The first thing we heard was, we need civilian technologies as bargaining chips. Well, my first question to you is, how's that working out for you in North Korea, Mr. Speaker? They signed the '94 agreement, they signed an agreement in 2003, they signed an agreement in 2006. The only common denominator amongst them was that the moment North Korea decided it got all it could from that particular agreement, it booted the IAEA out again and held the West to ransom again to keep its program along. No thank you, you guys wouldn't take a single one from us. You're going to be lucky if you get one in my speech. Then we heard, well, it's the moral message because, it's the ideological basis that all we want is civilian technologies. So therefore, if you give them to us, we're quelled. Mr. Speaker, which Iran are we talking about? Is it the same Iran that said they want to wipe Israel off the face of the map and then has a president who has talked about nuclear annihilation and talked about a desire for nuclear weapons? It's just not true. The ideological basis is not, no thank you, one of only getting civilian technologies. But more importantly, no thank you. We just say that it sends a silly message for the West to be constantly beholden to states that won't really engage with it constructively, that won't honour real agreements and that won't move forward. Because all it does is undermine our hand every time we give in to them. And the North Korean experience shows that. It emboldened Iran to play the exactly the same game of bluff. No thank you. Let's then look at this question, no thank you, of need. Because what you heard in closing was they need it because of the fact that their energy isn't actually great. And although we were correct when we said that they export energy because they have a hell of a lot of gas, Mr. Speaker, even if we apply that to another level of analysis, it doesn't hold up. If there was a desperate need for power, for electricity generation within Iran, if it was really dire straits, why are they going down a path of building tiny reactors that's going to take them 20 years to finish and produce any electricity? We think that if Iran are really genuine about this, we need more electricity, then they'd be building gas-fired stations and more gas-fired stations, not going down the hazy path of getting into an alliance with Russia to build a tiny reactor that's not going to be done for a hell of a long time. No thanks, guys. Sorry, no, it was pretty bad from you. Let's then look at this question of, well, the people want nuclear power. No thank you. We do not accept that from the beginning. We say some sections of the Iranian government, like those in power and like the warmongers, want nuclear power and nuclear technology. We'd say a hell of a lot of Iran is young and progressive and doesn't like the nuclear program because it turned their country into an international pariah, stop them being able to study at universities abroad because their passports half the time aren't honoured, stop their country being one in which they can set up a business that ever hopes to do trade with the West, and has made them into a state that they do not like to be a part of. So we just don't accept in this debate that there's some consensus in Iran for nuclear weapons. But to move to the opening, when the opposition leader said, why isn't Iran allowed nuclear weapons? Why are they allowed nuclear weapons? Why was this nuclear technology rather? Why was this a debate about rights? What rights does Iran have given its track record? Because this was a change debate. We proposed a different policy. We rejected the paradigm of the original NPT that you don't have a right to nuclear weapons, but you have a right to nuclear technologies. That's why Chris spent an exceptional amount of time talking about why the two are easily transferable. Why allowing one will necessarily give creed to a movement towards the other. No thank you. Importantly as well, Mr. Speaker, we just think that in a situation when Iran is doing it on the sly, having to sneak things in, trying to do it all a bit on the dodge, they're not going to do a very good job of protecting their nuclear facilities from either internal mistake or external attack. France has AA batteries around its nuclear reactors to stop them being under attack. We don't think Iran's ever going to be able to provide that sort of security, and we think the fact that it's using Russian offcasts is going to seriously question the safety. Yes?
Sir, your characterization of the domestic population is problematic. There is a reason why Ahmadinejad was really powerful at first. So what you're doing is giving him the ammunition to counter the US ground gate against
Madam,
him.
there was a reason he was powerful at first, because he proposed a system of foreign policy that made his country into a pariah, and now he's less powerful and popular as a result. Also, in debating, it's a bit disingenuous to say, hey, a dictator who controls the media and oppresses dissent is popular, therefore his policies are right. Let's move then to this third question. How do we strengthen or weaken the NPT? What you heard at opening was Russia and China will just walk away under this. I don't think that's the case. There's two reasons. Firstly, Russia and China have consistently shown a willingness to stay within multilateral organisations even when the fall of the coin goes against them. The reason for that is that they know their hand will never be stronger than when they're sitting at a table with the West and debating. So that's why they're very keen to join the WTO, even though it requires a liberalisation of markets that they don't particularly like. It's why they've stayed in the United Nations Security Council, even when things have happened in that Security Council, like the sanctioning of China's relationship with Darfur, that they have not liked. That's why we think they're going to stay. But more importantly, we think they're going to cut down their use of nuclear technology proliferation as a means of expanding their foreign policy. For this reason, these countries work on a basis of pushing the West as far as they can before they draw a big reaction. So when you say to them, now, giving technology to Iran is not just a bit dodgy, but allowed under the NPT, but is actually completely illegitimate under the NPT, then you give the West a much bigger stick to threaten China and Russia with to stop them expanding those technologies. So there's going to be less chance of China being emboldened by the Iranian experience and moving forward into Central Asia. But lastly, when these guys said, hey, multilateral bodies are the way to move forward, once again, how's that working out for you with nuclear proliferation? We'd say instead, there's been no multilateral body, there have been three cross purposes. Russia actively helping, the EU being pansies and getting pushed around, and the US running in with hawk sticks. That's why the multilateral regime hasn't worked, and that's why we need a tough stance. Mr. Speaker, Iran is not a trustworthy country, it's not a righteous country, it's not a deserving country, and nuclear technology should not be placed in the hands of it.
I thank the government with for closing the case on that bench, and now to do the same thing the opposition with.
Ladies and gentlemen, non-proliferation is also a battle of hearts and minds. It's not just about making sure that there are inspectors. Why can certain rogue nations stay popular? Why can Ahmadinejad gain popularity back? Because his rhetoric is confirmed. Because whenever he says the West is being unfair, the West does become unfair and treats them with a double standard. They said that students are getting strong now. But we say the reason why Mohammed Khatami, the guy who was popular with the students, got sidelined by Ahmadinejad is precisely because of previous standards that espoused a double standard. We say there's something wrong with that, ladies and gentlemen, and there's something even more wrong with that now, given that Iran has already made a concession, given that we've already proved that there are no nuclear arms in Iran. And even if that happened, ladies and gentlemen, even if the United States intelligence community itself affirms that, Bush comes back and says, we'll impose a double standard on you. Think how dangerous that becomes, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to discuss two issues in this debate. First, I want to look at the issue of diplomacy, and then I want to look at the issue of privacy. Let's examine diplomacy first, ladies and gentlemen. Because opening government came up here and they said, we undermine the rhetoric of nationalism under their model. We say, but at the same breath, they say, we're imposing a double standard on Iran, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is, no thank you, if you listen to speeches from Iran right now, they use the rhetoric of international community is treating us unfairly, ladies and gentlemen, and what you're doing is you're confirming that, ladies and gentlemen. So yes, he already thinks that, that's true, and we're not going to change his mind, but there's a difference when we affirm that, ladies and gentlemen. Now the question here is, not what is the right thing to do historically, ladies and gentlemen, but what are the realpolitik conditions of today, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, if we say, if diplomacy concerns you, then you need a concerted effort, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot abandon countries like Russia. You need Russia. The opening opposition said you need Russia, and we concretize this. Why do you need Russia? Precisely because Russia has a veto in the UNSC, ladies and gentlemen. So if you want to do something about Iran, if you want to sanction them in the future, if you want to do something about them, even if you want to attack them, you need the approval of the UNSC. And I don't think that's going to work. If you undermine the current efforts of Russia to engage Iran, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at Russia, it is an entity that usually plays on face politics. In other words, if you insult it, it retaliates. That's what happened, no thank you. That's what happened in the case of, for example, the Star Wars program, where it retaliated by setting up missiles in Poland. If you do this with them right now, you give them all the incentive to retaliate in the UNSC because they want to save face, ladies and gentlemen. If you want a concerted, sustainable effort with Iran, then we say you need the UNSC's help, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. Moreover, we say, if you want negotiations, then you perpetually need a carrot with respect to these people, ladies and gentlemen. And we say a carrot occurs when you have this ability to trade with them. It's not just about sticks, it's also about carrots. But in effect, if you say the UNSC, we will never do this, then you deny yourself that carrot to offer them these particular nuclear reactors. Yes, closing.
So Iran doesn't need any of these nuclear
nuclear technology program to power purposes. All they need it for is nuclear weapons.
But that's not the
circumstance,
issue.
I'm not
That's
worried
not the
about
issue.
negotiation.
The issue is not whether or not that they need it. The issue is we need to give them the reactors so they can't go, we're enriching uranium because we need the energy, ladies and gentlemen. Never mind if they have it or not, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is, we undercut that particular excuse. They can't go, we'll continue enriching because we don't have it. But if you give it to them, which is precisely what Russia's doing, you deny them that particular rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen. And this is precisely what happened in the case of North Korea, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. In the case of the 1994 Agreed Framework, the reason why they were able to sit down was that you said you would give them light water reactors. The reason why they sat down in the 1990 in the six-party talks was because you had this particular offer. But then CEO comes up and says, well, you know, these reactors are just an excuse. They use it for continual bargaining, ladies and gentlemen. But we say we have to assess the reason why the 1994 Agreed Framework didn't work. It didn't work because the US did not give the light water reactors. Because the US was espousing the same logic that is being forwarded by closing this debate, by closing government this debate. And by the way, they were really bad, ladies and gentlemen. No thanks. So we say, yes, ladies and gentlemen, these people can get unreasonable, and we will accept that they are getting unreasonable. But we say the question, the more important question that needs to be posed is, given that they're unreasonable, and given that sometimes the unreasonability gets support, how does your model solve that particular problem, ladies and gentlemen? Because we say, yes, carrots don't work all the time, but if you shut out the ability to use carrots bar none, ladies and gentlemen, then that places you in a diplomatic straitjacket where you cannot access this particular resolution at the end of the day. No thanks. So let me look at the second issue of this debate, which is really the issue of privacy. Because they said, we don't want to drive these people underground. And we say, fine. But we say, what does a double standard do? Beyond rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, and we concretize this on the level of rhetoric, we say that the double standard gives Iran the rhetorical capital to pull out of the NPT. They'll be able to justify pulling out of the NPT. No thanks. Because they'll be able to say, I'm pulling out of the NPT because the United States and all these other countries have turned the NPT into something unfair. No thanks. Now, what's the problem with pulling out of the NPT? In case you didn't know, ladies and gentlemen, if you pull out of the NPT, you have no obligation to let the IAEA in. No thanks. Because if you look, what is the IAEA? The IAEA is the enforcement body of the NPT. In other words, if you give them an excuse to pull out of the NPT, if you give them a reason to pull out of the NPT, you give them a greater reason and a legitimate legal reason to kick out the IAEA, ladies and gentlemen, because the IAEA requires treaty legitimacy, which you are compromising at this juncture in the debate. No, thank you. Now, we'll agree. The line between civilian and nuclear energy is thin, ladies and gentlemen, and that's precisely why you don't want to pull out the body. That they're able to determine whether or not there is civilian nuclear energy or whether or not there is military nuclear energy. No, thank you. If we agree with that particular line, ladies and gentlemen, then I think, if you agree with that particular line, Mr. Chair, then I think you should give this debate to Ataneo, ladies and gentlemen. Because if you want to know whether or not it's civilian, whether or not it's nuclear, then we need a body that will be able to tell, ladies and gentlemen. That's exactly what happened in Iraq. That's what's being that's what's happening in North Korea, ladies and gentlemen. If you give them an excuse to shut out the IAEA, then that's where you create conditions where you don't see what's happening. That's where Iran will not be able to be held accountable, because you cannot hold them accountable on the first level, on the ground level of actually seeing what they're doing, but you also won't be able to hold them accountable legally, ladies and gentlemen, because the IAEA and the NPT, ladies and gentlemen, is a legal framework through which you can hold people accountable, ladies and gentlemen. Let go of this particular legal framework and you will not be able to hold them accountable on that international level. Other countries will ditch you, ladies and gentlemen, because Russia will perceive this as an assault on their policy. And moreover, ladies and gentlemen, what they've never addressed, you will strengthen the rhetoric of the person we don't want to see more of. We don't want to see more of Ahmadinejad. We don't want to see him demonize the West. Therefore, we shouldn't give him an excuse to demonize the West. Ataneo takes this debate. See you in the front.
Stay here.